1893 in Chicago was the first Parliament of the World's Religions. And what I want to tell you about that is that it was a watershed event that was really the first ever dialogue between East and West, between religious and spiritual leaders from the East and from the West. What I'd also like you to know about that gathering is that the Parliament of the World's Religions part of it was an afterthought. That this was the time of the Chicago Exposition, and they were building a model city, and the whole purpose of this gathering was to talk about modern life and how much progress human beings had made. And somebody, thank God, had the wisdom to say, well, if we're going to be talking about the progress of humanity, perhaps we should invite religious and spiritual leaders to the table. And that is how the idea for having the Parliament of the World's Religions connected to the Chicago Exposition began. On the list of invited leaders to this auspicious gathering, you would not find the name Swami Vivekananda. But on the history of that moment in time, I don't think you will ever read it without hearing his name. And so that in itself is such a powerful testimony to the spiritual consciousness of this man. He was called inwardly to the Parliament of the World's Religions, but he wasn't formally invited. He just knew that he was supposed to address this gathering, and so he came. And so somehow he got onto the program. And what happened now is written in the history books. In his very first talk, he stood before this audience in America and said, "My brothers and sisters of America." People stood up, gave him a standing ovation. What was that? It was his being. It was his consciousness that was communicating. And then and then he went on to tell this largely, Western audience, you are not sinners, and it is a mistake to think of yourself in that way. No, he said, you are sharers of immortal bliss. You are divine beings. And so he just stood up and spoke the truth, cut through all dogma and said, you are the divine self. Don't think of yourself as a sinner. That is a mistake. And you would think that, 1893, they might have thrown some tomatoes at him. But because he was speaking the truth, they felt it, they knew it, they recognized it. And so what happened was they stayed with him. Everyone wanted to hear Swami Vivekananda. So the organizing committee behind the Parliament of the World's Religions invited him back the next day. And they invited him at the end of the day because he was pulling the crowds. And so they literally invited him to come every day because he was the person that people wanted to hear. And, I think, wow, to have heard him speak. But his consciousness, his awakened consciousness, was so powerful that you can actually pick it up from his words in his writing. So if you have not yet read any of the books written by Swami Vivekananda, then I encourage you to do that, because you will pick up on his spirit. His consciousness permeates those words. And just a couple other things I will say about him. As Shunyaji said, he lived a short life. He said he wouldn't make it till 40, and he didn't. But he didn't waste any time in the decades that he had. He was a tireless worker. And part of his appeal for me in his spirit is the spirit of no nonsense, straightforward truth, and courage. You know, he wanted to know the truth, and he wanted to know it directly. When you read the stories about him as a young man, he was not a believer. And of course, you can't really know completely about Vivekananda unless you read also about his guru, Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa, because in their relationship you come to understand more about the young Naren and how he became Swami Vivekananda. But when he came to Sri Ramakrishna, he said, "Can you show me God?" He didn't want to just hear about spiritual teachings. He wanted someone who could actually show it to him. And evidently he picked the right person. They were destined to be together, because Sri Ramakrishna was able to support Vivekananda in opening his consciousness in such a way that he had that direct experience. And towards the end of his life, of course, he always talked about the truth and how it was not so important necessarily to study texts even, but to realize, to know for yourself. So someone said to him, "Well, Swamiji, why then do you think it's important that we study the Vedas?" And he said, "In order to cure superstition. In order that people understand this direct path to truth, that they can know it for themselves and they can find it for themselves." And I'll conclude with a little story that is perhaps my favorite about him. That when he was in California, he went they were in a campsite, camping somewhere in the wilderness with a small group of devotees, and were sitting around a campfire, and the time came for meditation. And Swami Vivekananda said to them, "You can meditate on whatever you like. I am going to meditate on the heart of a lion." And the woman telling the story said it was the most powerful meditation they had ever had. So whenever I think of Swami Vivekananda and I think of how he came to America and so changed the course of interreligious history, I think of his courage in doing that, of just speaking the truth. I think about how we can all meditate on the heart of a lion and cultivate that kind of courage. Namaste.